A majority of Canadians feel politically homeless. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The National Post reports that from a recent poll, about 57% of Canadians feel politically homeless, and another way to phrase that is the majority of Canadians are feeling like they don't have a party that they can belong to. Now, at first glance, that itself is interesting. It's not like it's a bad thing intrinsically to be politically homeless. In fact, I'd argue it could be a very good thing, but it's a question of how you get there. There's a bad way of arriving at that result, and there's a good way at arriving there. A good way would be something like there is a plethora of options. They all bring something very interesting to the table. They're all professional. They're all good. There's a shared vision of how to move towards a better Canada. And I'm having a hard time picking a party because they all seem to have massive benefits to them and very little detriments. That would be a good situation. That would be the best case scenario of being politically homeless. A bad way, though, that notion can manifest is if you find yourself in an environment where all the parties pretty much suck, and you feel like you have to choose between the lesser of a couple evils here. You don't want to associate with a party because there's a questionable side to them, and every party seems to have that. Now, look at the Canadian political landscape and tell me which one of those two realities you think is most accurate, which is most fitting for the current times. There is no doubt that it's the latter, that we've arrived at the notion of being politically homeless via a bad route. That we're stranded here, not by choice, but because we don't find much hope in the current selection. We can do a quick glance at the parties to see why that might be. We can begin with the Conservatives. One of the biggest issues that they face is a lack of progress, really, being stuck in the mud on many pivotal issues. We can see just last week, the Conservative Party couldn't even agree to recognize climate change. Now, it is one thing to debate about what you should do. It could be another thing to debate about the urgency at which you must move. But to debate about recognizing it, though, that is many fundamental levels behind where they should be. It's simply irresponsible and not intelligent at all to be taking that stance in 2021. I guarantee you, that ruling, that party decision, is probably going to cost them the next election. There are thousands of people who cannot stomach that. That will be the straw that breaks the Conservative Party's back for sure. Many people who are looking at Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh of the Liberal NDP parties, even though they don't totally like their platforms, they may be swayed to vote for them simply because they recognize climate change. Even though they both have a lackluster approach to the problem, at least they recognize it. You have the Conservative Party, often the void here, who are making foolish mistakes and stumbling over themselves over and over again. You could very well be conservative by nature and still recognize the idiocy of such a stance, and that could drive you away from supporting this party. Now you can look at the Liberal Party for a different example. They've been ripe with corruption scandals. Trudeau's been in the midst of many. You have the We Charity, SNC-Lavalin, and it's clear that either he's an extreme fool or he simply doesn't care about following the rules. Now I will say you have to give him credit where credit is due. Overall, I feel like Trudeau has handled the pandemic well. I'm not too sure I'd want, well, it would have been Andrew Scheer instead, running the country amidst the COVID crisis. I think we did end up ahead by having Trudeau in leadership during this time. But he's not perfect, and he has many flaws. And if you want to take it away from Trudeau himself and apply the lens to the party, many people are worrying about the left. They seem to be caught up in wokeism, in eating themselves and destroying true liberal principles. Notions like free speech and expression and whatnot have come under attack, and it's no secret that the left is behind much of that. For all of the things that they've accomplished, it seems they've reached an inflection point where items like free speech are being curbed, where They'll tell you they are on the side of progressivism, but they're actually regressing. Many policies are bringing us back in time. Many policies that we're seeing here, not even just policies as well, the culture is rolling us back in terms of rights, in terms of progress, in terms of unity as a country. And fundamentally, it does come from this new school of thinking, the far left woke ideology that has infiltrated the mainstream leftist narrative. And it's a problem. Now, they do many things well. They at least are recognizing climate change. They're tuned in to some of the major issues of the current times, but the ways in which they've approached it, it has left a sour taste in many people's mouths, and we can see here the result of that. The majority of Canadians feeling that they have no home politically. A rational person would have many reservations about going out there and saying, yes, I am a true conservative or I am a true liberal in the Canadian political context, because those terms come with connotations. If you say you are fully embedded within the Conservative Party ideology, does that mean that you too can't even recognize climate change? I'm sure you wouldn't want that. Or if you say you're fully embedded in the liberal leftist doctrine, does that mean you are for all these crazy woke notions that we're seeing come out of there? You might not want to associate with that either. You might be forced to pick between the lesser of the two evils every election, and that's kind of where we are. Now, you can look outside of the big two and take a party like the Bloc Québécois, who is solely focused on Quebec, which I think is a failing, especially when you're running a federal party. How can you have a party that is vying for leadership of all of Canada that explicitly tells you they're only concerned truly with the well-being of one province? You would not vote for them if you reside outside of Quebec. Then you have Maxime Bernier's People Party. They seem to be perhaps getting closer to too conservative, too right. It would be the alter ego, you could say, of the NDP, who many would say are too leftist, who perhaps are living in a dream world, who are not realistic. Their platform truly is something interesting. Many promises, lots of big spending, but no true answer on how it makes any sense or how it's affordable or how to actually go about it. So, that's the field right now. If you are one of these people who does feel like you are politically without a home, the silver lining here is that you're actually normal for thinking that. The majority of Canadians feel that same way based on this poll, and you aren't alone. And further, I would say it's actually quite rational to feel that way, given this set of options. They're just not that appealing. And there does seem to be a change needed to correct for that. Now, as I said before, there's a good way to become politically homeless when the vast majority of the options are attractive and they're good. And the reason why you're having a problem finding a party to identify with is because there are many great options to pick from, and you don't want to tie yourself to just one. But we have the opposite scenario, where all the parties are pretty crappy and you don't want to smear yourself by being tied to one. These trends do point towards something else as well, though. It's possible that there is a desire for a more centrist party. If I were to identify myself as somewhere on the political spectrum, I would say I am, in fact, a centrist, and I do think many people are moving towards there. Why? Well, for many of the reasons we just talked about. The right has become quite rigid with many issues. There's no reason why something like wearing a mask had to become political, and many of those on the right had to adopt the stance of not wanting it. That was idiotic. There's no reason why the right can't even acknowledge climate change. These are very unattractive measures there. And many rational people are abandoning that and moving closer to the left. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have a similar phenomenon where the left has become indoctrinated, indulging in woke memes. Seemingly, logic has been abandoned there, and many true liberal principles that people truly value are being abandoned, and it's worrisome. And they're seeing on the right, at least, those individuals there seem to be trying to uphold notions of free speech and whatnot. So many of those who once resided on the left are moving towards the right now. So what do you have there? As a net result, there's a convergence on the middle. Those on the right who don't currently like the trajectory are going to the left. Those on the left who don't like the current pace are moving towards the right. And there's a swell of people there who find themselves in the center, who can recognize, yeah, some liberal policies do make a lot of sense. Climate change, you would want the liberals in charge of that. Not so much the conservatives who can't even agree that it's real. But at the same time, there are fundamental pillars of society which should be upheld. Not everything has to be torn down. And sometimes going the woke way is actually counterproductive. There are pros and cons to both sides there, so picking a party, given the many glaring flaws that each of them has, is not quite smart. Could Canada use a centrist party that would balance the scales in a sense, who would recognize some of the major issues that the left talks about, while also hanging on to some of the core pillars of our society, while also still abiding by logical presuppositions and notions, by not being tied down to dogma, whether it's the dogma of lies on the right or the dogma of lies on the left, to be free of that, to simply seek good ideas regardless of where they come from. I guarantee you, in our current environment, if the Conservative Party were to come up with a great idea, those on the left would disparage it simply because of its origin. And the opposite's true too. If the Liberals were to come up with a good idea, many of those on the right would disparage it simply again because of its origin. And we see a funny tale there with something like the carbon tax because it was originally a conservative idea. It's a market measure to tackle climate change, but somehow, somewhere, the Conservative Party abandoned their own idea, the Liberals took it, and now the Conservative Party hates it. Very ironic. Now, I also want to make myself clear. I'm not saying here that we need perfect parties or something, or some delusional fairy tale like that. These politicians are very human. The parties are human constructs, and there are flaws there. There will always be flaws, but there are ways to mitigate the amount and severity of them. We should truly be voting for the best of the bunch, and we should have an environment that's conductive of that. In some sense, we are voting in ways to avoid the worst of the bunch. We're not happy with this election. They suck. Bluntly put. We're voting for the lesser of the two evils every time. We are weighing the cons, basically, and finding which party has the fewest of them. We can't even look at the pros because people are viewing the other side as some form of evil, one way or another. It has given rise to a form of strategic voting which is masking the true sentiments of the country. And one example of that is, let's say somehow you find yourself to be a supporter of the NDP party. You might run the math there and say, well, I don't really like the Liberal Party, but voting for the NDPs might not make the most sense because if I do that, I take away a vote from my second favorite party, and I empower my least favorite, which might be the Conservative Party. In a sense, you get the notion that your vote is wasted, because the NDP really is not that popular, and you would much prefer the lesser of the two evils there between the other choices. And the same thing could be true for right-leaning people. You might find yourself in favor of Maxime Bernier's People Party of Canada, but you might run the same math in your head, and you could say, well, it doesn't make so much sense for me to vote for them, because despite whatever you enjoy about their platform, they're not really that popular. And taking a vote away from your second choice, which would presumably be the Conservative Party, is going to enable the Liberal Party, because you weaken their main competition. So you might decide, well, forget that. I won't truly vote where my heart is, you could say. I'll vote strategically to avoid the lesser of the two evils there. That's not truly a good system. Why? Because people aren't free to vote in the ways in which they want. And the polling is going to be inherently misleading. Because we're not seeing the true sentiment. We're seeing people who are trying to be cunning and applying a level of logic to the voting process, when in reality, you should be free to vote for who you want to vote for without worrying about the consequences there. Now, there's one way to alleviate that via changing the voting procedures, doing something like a ranked ballot, and another way to do it is simply by having better parties where you won't feel devastated if one of these other parties wins because you know they're not going to do something catastrophic to the country. You're okay to vote for the party you truly want to vote for because you know there isn't a hellscape waiting for you on the other side of that equation if your party doesn't win. But we do once again have the opposite of that. Now, the final thing I want to say is that this finding does give some hope, though, within the context of political polarization. We've seen the parties move towards the extremes. We have the right probably moving a little bit too close to things like climate deniers and conspiracy theory thinking and whatnot. And we have the left moving way too close. It's actually arguable they've already been consumed by far left thinking and wokeism. Crazy, crazy ideas that have no grounding in logic, that are easily torn apart in any debate, but they won't even engage in the debate, and they'll shut you down prior to having that to, first of all, shield them from being exposed, and second, to eat the tail of free speech, something that was a true liberal value that's now been turned away by the party that calls themselves liberal. Although the parties have frayed like this and vocal minorities of people on the edges have spoken up and they've turned up the temperature, it seems like the average Canadian isn't playing that game. In fact, the majority of Canadians, based on this poll, have decided to abandon parties versus tying themselves down to the mast of them. It would be depressing in this environment if maybe 10% of Canadians found themselves homeless. I would question that. I would say, why are you still riding out for these parties when they're so clearly flawed? But the data shows that the average Canadian, instead of doing that, has abandoned the ideology. And they're moving towards something like the middle. They're saying, forget the left, forget the right. There's too much idiocy going down here. I can't, in good faith, say I represent one of these parties here. There's just too much madness, and I'm trying to find an answer. That's what I think we have to do. That's actually a step in the right direction. So it is some type of silver lining to see this number here. You could say, yeah, it's indicative of a failed system. It's indicative of bad choices, but at least the people have the logic and the forethought to get there versus doubling down on those failed parties. They've strayed from them, and there is hope there that the polarization that we see and the toxicity is perhaps being absorbed and multiplied by a vocal minority. Not by the majority of Canadians, not by the average person, but by a few local people who have really doubled and tripled down on terrible ideas. Oftentimes, we do see narratives and content on social media that makes us believe that these vocal minority shareholders or speakers are running the show, but if these individuals who are abandoning party ideology, trying to find middle grounds, trying to stray away from traditional ideologue behavior, if this majority of people can band together and truly unite around a voice of reason, a voice that calls out lunacy for lunacy, a voice that refuses to go along with radical progressivism that makes zero sense, a voice that refuses to go along with climate denial and the issues on the right, a voice that simply seeks good ideas for good ideas, regardless of where they originate, a voice that will not betray itself simply to uphold a party image, a voice that will, in fact, speak truth. If we can get that from this group of people, we do have a great path forward, a path that I believe in, a path that we can all believe in, a path that can correct for the issues that we see today. At first glance, the news report may have seemed discouraging. It may have highlighted to you the fact that we do have really failed political and cultural systems, but at the same time, there is good news there and there is hope. The fact that people recognize that and they are not doubling down. They're saying that we don't want to play this foolish game anymore and we want another answer. I think that answer can come in the rise of centricism, simply just not abiding by party dogmas anymore and moving forward in the name of truth. But we'll see how things play out. This is encouraging though, and as I've laid out, if you are one of these people who feels that they can't just tie themselves to a party anymore, given the craziness that comes out of them, you're among friends. There's many people who feel that way, even if they don't voice it to you. Even if on social media, you're seeing a lot of the crazies talking all the time. In real life, The majority of Canadians are on your side there, and it is the right place to be. Don't tie yourself to failed parties. Seek better options. Seek the truth and don't be afraid to share your opinions. That's how we get out of this mess. Turn down the temperature. Break free from the curse of political polarization. Learn to see fellow Canadians once again as people seeking a better future. There are different ways in which they interpret that, but still, we have a shared goal as Canadians, not as these divided, fragmented, intersectional groups. We are Canadian. We are together in this, and that's the way we have to move forward. If we truly do want to move forward, if we want to pause in time, if we want to halt progress, if we want to move backwards, then we should continue as we are now. Because that's clearly the trajectory that we're on. Somebody has got to hit the brakes and bring reason and rationality back to the conversation. So, that now brings us to the end of our discussion for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.